I start every single recording with the word okay. I guess I don't know. Anyways, so we're going to talk about the Cold War in the 1960s, and I've done a very quick run through of the 1950s and kind of Truman and Eisenhower. We will look at NSC 68, and we've kind of talked about how the Cold War shapes the culture and some of the cultural changes that will come from not only World War II, but also this Cold War that's happening, and really the post-World War II world with the baby boom and all that kind of stuff. But now we're going to focus on the 1960s, and there's a couple of key events that happened in the 1960s that really kind of shape the decade and shape the Cold War as we look at it developing in the 70s and 80s and that kind of thing. So we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy some, but we're also going to kind of recap the 50s. Remember that we have this persistent fear of an atomic attack, with Sputnik and that kind of thing. You have the creation of NASA. Lots of concern about loyalty, lots of concern about what people think, what people say, what the media is telling us. And so you have that really being a huge piece of it. And when we look at NSC 68, we'll see that we have a really expanding military, right? And we have this notion of opposing communism and the idea of communism, not just fighting one specific country or having, we're going to take this hill or we're going to push, this dictator out of this territory or something like that. It's this large ideological battle. The next thing is the prosperity, but whether you're talking about the GI Bill and the fact that, in the early 1950s, Europe is rebuilding. Europe is, has been a mess because they've been dealing with World War I and a depression in World War II. So the U.S. has all this industrial capability. So there's a lot of prosperity in the 1950s and a large middle class, lots of automobiles, suburbs, all that kind of stuff. The GI Bill has allowed for a growing professional class. And so you have a lot of these kind of impacts happening. But there's also some negatives to that, right? Things like the strict gender roles, the emphasis on conformity. And then, of course, because we're very concerned about communism and because we're concerned about this ideological struggle, a lot of the 1950s is designed to kind of define the U.S. against communism. If that's what the Soviet Union is, we're not that. And that's why you have these very strict gender roles. That's why you have this focus on, these American values. And it's very ironic that you have, for all that America stands for individualism and freedom and all that kind of thing, that you actually have this focus on conformity. In the 1950s. And of course, we also tend to create the existence of a teenager. Adolescents, people from, say, 14 to, 20, 21, prior to the 1950s, many times, unless you were, in a particular social class where you got to make decisions about going to college or something, and I'm being a little bit rigid, I suppose. There were people that worked their way up from blue-collar families and got college educations and that kind of thing. But for the most part, you were making, when you're 16 years old, if you're going to go into the family business or go work on the family farm, or if, you're going to go to college. You don't have the prevalence of high school education. It's not accepted that everyone's going to get a high school diploma. And that's really going to change in the 1950s with this focus on, we're going to let our kids be kids as opposed to the Soviet Union and the way they kind of indoctrinate people and kind of decide ahead of time what you're going to do and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of kind of social changes that are happening there. I don't think I've really talked about the role of media and television. Of course, the 1950s are the period of the TV. And that's going to be huge, right? You have this idea of dynamic conservatism. So we have with Truman leaving office in 52, really kind of, you see the country moving away from that liberalism of the New Deal, of big government, of government programs. And you definitely saw that Truman started to talk about things like national health care and civil rights and what we would identify as liberal concerns. And the United States, whether it, probably largely because of Truman's handling of the Korean conflict and the Cold War, but also because I think the country just was kind of exhausted, right? We'd had all this stuff happening for several decades, and I think they just kind of didn't want to have to mess with it anymore. So you have the embrace of kind of Republicans and a conservative value, but understand that the Eisenhower Republicans, the Republicans of the 1950s, are not the kind of Republicans that you have in 2016. These are Republicans that believe that government still has a role to play. Now, they may not feel that it has the same role that New Deal Democrats thought or extreme progressives thought, but they still see the government as playing a role. And so you definitely see that Eisenhower's administration tries to address some of the social problems. You're going to see that Eisenhower will support, the Brown v. Board decision. You'll see that Eisenhower, the Interstate Highway Act. He's going to be concerned about the growing poverty gap, because while you have prosperity being for this middle class, that middle class is predominantly white. So you're going to have, and because you have the growth of suburbs, you're going to have kind of this migration away from the inner cities. And what that's going to leave us with are inner cities that are really struggling, that have lost tax base and have lost, they're losing stores and all that kind of stuff because the people with money are in the suburbs. And so he's trying to deal with that kind of stuff, deal with poverty, deal with expanding education through the NDEA and that kind of thing. And so, Republicans, this dynamic conservatism is really struggling to handle these issues. And they are. And it's not this idea that we don't want any government involved. They're just looking for ways to have small government involved. New social trends, television, I mentioned that already. That's a huge impact. The idea, I Love Lucy and the Ed Sullivan Show and all that kind of stuff. Television as we know it begins in the 1950s, and by the end of the decade, every house has a television pretty much. Rock and roll music, and I already kind of addressed that with the young people, but that's a profound shift in kind of culture and music trends along the lines of jazz music, right? And so it's a very big deal in a lot of ways. So Eisenhower, that kind of covers a recap of some of the main concepts from the 1950s that we'll be looking at. So you get to 1960. Come back. And in 1960, Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president, is going to run against JFK. John Kennedy, of course, is young. He's a Catholic from Boston. The Kennedys were, very well off, very wealthy. His dad had served as an ambassador to England during World War II. Nixon, of course, was the vice president, and I had mentioned before that he had he'd taken some campaign money that he shouldn't have, and Eisenhower famously didn't like him. In fact, Eisenhower never really, fully endorsed Nixon as a president. And Nixon was very resentful of that. He felt like the Republican leadership never really appreciated him. And so you're going to have this contest, and there's a whole interesting, CNN did a thing on the 1960 election a couple weeks ago. There's a really interesting, Kennedy getting the nomination was a big deal. He manages to do that, and the election is actually very, very close. It is not a shoo-in for Kennedy by any stretch of the imagination. And so you're going to see that that poor Nixon is going to end up looking pretty bad. The televised debates, when I was watching that CNN special, they were talking about how Nixon had injured his knee during the campaign, and so as he's going into the televised debate, he hits his knee on the car door, and so when he's in pain and he's hurting, right, and he basically refuses any kind of makeup or anything like that, and so when the televised debate begins, he ends up looking very kind of sweaty and kind of pale and washed out, and Kennedy has this very calm demeanor, and he's very kind of polished and all that kind of stuff. And so that's really, Kennedy's debate is going to be a huge win for him. He's going to come off really sounding young and enthusiastic. And remember, we have this growing group of young people, right? And, the baby boomers, depending on what year they were born, if you were born in 1940, if your parents, if your dad had signed up for the military and your parents had gotten married, you're going to be you're going to be voting age in 1960. Now I take that back because voting age is 21 at that point. But you're close to voting age, right? And you're going to have some of those people that are starting to get very interested. And those young people, that optimism, and these families with young people are going to really listen to Kennedy and what he's talking about. And so there's going to be, it's a very close election. It's the votes in Chicago that actually come under question. The accusation is that the Kennedy family had some kind of underworld mafia ties, and that maybe they influenced the votes in Chicago, that they had dead people voting and stuff like that. So there is some accusation there. But at the end of the day, Kennedy wins. And when he comes in, you're going to see him bringing with him this kind of this mystique, this attitude of youthful exuberance and Camelot. And Jackie Kennedy is a new kind of first lady, very, especially after you're talking about, Eleanor Roosevelt and Bess Truman and whatever Eisenhower's wife's name was. And, these were kind of older, kind of frumpy looking ladies. And so here's, Jackie Kennedy and all that kind of stuff. And remember, we have a lot of concern about this missile gap that, especially by the time you get to 1958, that the Soviets are making more nuclear missiles than the United States. Remember, Sputnik happens in 1957. So as we're going into the 1960 election, the Cold War and this concern about falling behind to communism is a really big deal. And one of the critiques of JFK was that the Democrats would not be hard enough on communism. And you can think, this perception with Truman on that. So you're going to have, all of that. But you're also going to see that Cuba in the 1950s, when the Republicans are in charge, Cuba, that remember we had kind of had a protectorate there thanks to the Spanish-American War, and we had really taken advantage of Cuba, controlled who their politicians were, controlled their constitution, controlled their foreign relations, and really kind of used Cuba as a kind of a market where we dumped American goods. And so Fidel Castro is going to rise up. He's going to lead a communist revolution. He's going to overthrow Batista, kick Batista out. This is when you have the Cubans escaping into the United States, right? And this is a relevant thing. Ted Cruz's family's his dad is from Cuba. We just had the reopening of Cuba with President Obama's visit. And so, this is where that comes in, right? So in the 1950s, Cuba falls to communism, and Castro comes in. He shuts the doors on Cuba. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the United States. The United States puts all these sanctions and embargoes, because what Castro does is he confiscates all American goods, right? And so by confiscating all these goods, the Americans are real upset. And so you have this whole issue with Cuba that JFK is going to say, well, look, while Truman might have been weak on communism, you can see what the Republicans did, and we have this problem in Cuba and all that kind of stuff. And so this huge fear of this missile gap, and so this idea of we don't want to be soft on communism is going to be a very powerful thing. And this is going to be particularly true as we consider kind of the development towards Vietnam, although that'll be in the next lecture. So just be sure you understand that the 1960 election was very close. JFK wins, and he actually, he was not a well person. He had a lot of medical issues, but the press back then just didn't cover things the way they do now. And so actually, we found out after his death how many medical issues he had. And of course, he was also kind of a hound dog. He, liked Marilyn Monroe and all that kind of stuff. But that's all kind of the TMZ part of his presidency. So yes, you definitely have this Camelot mystique. If you have any relatives that were alive during the Kennedy administration, you can ask them about that. They can tell you. So Kennedy's really going to focus on expanding education, expanding health insurance, trying to help kind of the blighted inner cities, and trying to address these concerns with migrant workers. Remember, I talked about Latino Americans and things like the UFW and that kind of thing. So he's trying to address that. However, you're going to have a lot of resistance in Congress. Republicans aren't going to be sure that they want to embrace a Democratic agenda. and they're going to be a little bit obstructionist. And Southern Democrats aren't sure how they feel about a Massachusetts Democrat being in office, right? So some of that, again, some of that racism, some of that, old school Southern Democrat stuff is going to be a problem for the Democratic Party in the 1960s. His economy, what we see by 1960 is the economy is starting to slow down some. Europe has started to recover from World War II, and they're able to produce their own stuff. So we're losing some market share, if you will. And we're having a little bit of trouble competing. Remember that the world after World War II is tied very much to open trade, free markets, that kind of international economic cooperation. And that's going to put a strain on the domestic economy. So he's struggling to keep that going. You're also going to see that, because of the defense spending, missile gap, NASA, that kind of stuff, we have some degree of defense spending and deficit spending. And, of course, all of this is in the name of national security. But he also tries to do this a little bit of supply side by cutting taxes, right? Well, the problem with trying to have government spending and cutting taxes is it's gonna create this big deficit and a big debt over a long period of time, especially if it's going towards something like military goods, is not always the best investment. Now, early on with Kennedy, I mean, it's not having the kind of effect that we'll see it having in the 1970s. But this is the beginning of that, okay, where we're trying to do a little bit of everything. And the reality is the economy is going to slow down because, we're having a globalization issue, right? And so rather than talking about that, we're trying to continue the same economic growth that we saw in the 50s. And it's just, you're not going to have that level of economic growth indefinitely. And so you see him focusing, I said, on a little bit of everything, kind of this mixed bag. If you're talking about civil rights, and we'll go into more detail with Kennedy and civil rights when we talk about the civil rights movement specifically, but talking about Kennedy and the Cold War, I will mention that his civil rights record was pretty lukewarm. He does finally endorse this idea of a Civil Rights Act in 1963, but that is a long process. I mean, that's, 2 years into his presidency, and he really resisted that. And he resisted it because he didn't want to lose the Southern Democrats. He knew that the Southern Democrats were very suspicious of him and were suspicious that he would try to push through civil rights legislation. And so he was very nervous, didn't want to lose that political power, didn't want to appear to be weak or become a lame duck or any of that kind of stuff. And so he's very reluctant. If you've seen the movie Selma, if you've seen The Butler or anything like that, you can definitely see where Kennedy is very cautious on civil rights. In fact, it's his brother Robert Kennedy, who's the one that's a very big civil rights activist, and he really pushes his brother to take a stand. Whether you're talking about James Meredith in Mississippi or you're talking the marches in Birmingham and Selma. And so he's going to be kind of slow on that. He's better when you're talking about women's rights. He does make a few more advances in that realm, and of course this is some of the impact of kind of the early women's rights movement, Gloria Steinem, the feminine mystique, and that kind of stuff. So be sure you kind of have that concept about Kennedy. The next thing that we want to know is that he focuses on trying to have a flexible response. In other words, by the time you get to 1960, and part of this is going to make sense when you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis and that kind of stuff, but there's definitely this sense in the 1960s that the United States is moving away from nuclear weapons. We don't want to abandon nuclear weapons because we know that the Soviets have nuclear weapons, but at the same time, we're tired of this full-on, we're going to build nuclear weapons, okay? And so he actually kind of turns to not just nuclear weapon technology, but also conventional weapons, right? That what we want to do is focus on soldiers and equipment and that kind of thing. This is why we have the creation of the special forces and that sort of thing. But he's also going to focus on, finding ways to support liberation movements. So when you're talking about a country that's undeveloped, where you've had a dictator and you have a democratic surge, making sure that we support those particular movements. Or conversely, if you have a movement that's communist, that we help the government kind of suppress that, right? And this is what we talk about with this idea of flexible response, that we don't have to send our troops in, we don't have to build up the nuclear weapons. What we can do instead is focus on, well, we're going to develop our technology. We're gonna send weapons. We're gonna send aid, whatever we have to kind of help this government withstand whatever threat they're facing and that kind of thing. So be sure you kind of understand that. And it's under Kennedy that we have this increasing aid towards Vietnam. And when I say increasing aid, I mean more than just sending a couple of advisors who unofficially are bringing a few boxes of guns, which is kind of what was happening under Eisenhower. Under Kennedy, it really ramps up. And that's part of this flexible response period, is that, we're going to have this ability to dabble in world affairs without being very overt about it, right? We're not going to be out there sending troops and threatening nuclear attacks and that brinksmanship that we saw with Eisenhower. Instead, we're going to kind of back off and we're going to kind of manipulate things from behind the scenes. And that's going to be an issue later on. As far as foreign aid, he tries to improve relations with Latin America. And of course, what that's going to result in is lots more CIA involvement in Latin America. This will create some resentment in Latin America. So if you're talking about relations with Brazil or Argentina, and some of those countries in 2016, one of the reasons why they're a little bit kind of offish with us is going to be because, here we've had this long policy with the Roosevelt Corollary, dollar diplomacy, and then you're going to have this alliance for progress. And for a lot of Latin American countries, they're suspicious of the United States and money and that kind of thing. Of course, the focus with Kennedy is on public works, not business investment. But it's still going to be, it's going to be an area of struggle. And the Peace Corps, that's something that Kennedy, of course, one of his famous speeches is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So he's trying to activate these young people and get them invested in the country. Well, we don't have a very clear-cut World War II kind of thing going on. So the idea of the Peace Corps is that you can serve the world, we can make the world a better place. And if you think in terms of, of things like the Four Freedoms speech, or if you think in terms of NSC 68, you can definitely see that the Peace Corps is an extension of this U.S. involvement, of the U.S. trying to increase cooperation and increase democracy all over the world without being too much, kind of like doing it from behind, if you will, lead from behind, I guess. So the Peace Corps is something else you need to be familiar with. And again, this ties into the number of young people that have been born after World War II. You're going to have the space race gets ramped up. Of course, we had Sputnik in 57, the creation of NASA and the NDEA in 58. By the time you get to 1961, the Soviets have a manned orbit. And of course, this freaks everybody out once again. JFK is going to say, you know what, we need to catch up. And he's going to set a goal of putting a man on the moon in 1969. And we will actually achieve that goal. What he says is put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, and we achieve it in August of 1969. So we do manage to do that. And you're going to see a lot of money being put towards NASA and that kind of thing. So be sure that you kind of understand that the space race under Kennedy, this idea of putting a man on the moon, that's largely due to him, even though it's going to be under LBJ and Richard Nixon that we actually see this task being completed. The other thing I want to point out about the space race, especially in relation to the Cold War, is that we have a lot of products and technology that come from the space race. And, that seems obvious. Like, why would I have to mention that? But I want to point it out because it's one of the things that you see when you look at star prep material is how do we connect the influence of something like the Cold War with multiple different facets. So it's not just about our involvement in Vietnam. It's not just about nuclear buildup. It's also about the cultural impact, right? It's also about things like technology impacts, whether you're talking computers or things like Velcro, or was it Tang, I guess, comes from the space race. So be sure you kind of connect all this technology. And really you have, for about 10, 15 years, I don't want to say a blank check, but you have NASA's pretty generously funded, especially when you compare it with what we were doing in the early 2000s. So absolutely, now we've really turned space exploration over to kind of private corporations, and we don't have this full-on kind of government effort. So understand that the space race in the 50s and 60s, or primarily in the 60s, is it's a government agency. This is a government program, much like building the Hoover Dam was a government program. So tie that, and you have the government developing this technology, not developing it to profit from it, but developing it because it's going to help us get to the moon, and hey, it's good for other stuff too. So you want to be sure you connect those things and see that as a part of the Cold War and a part of Kennedy's legacy and that sort of thing. The next major crisis I want to point out. So he wins in 60, takes the oath of office in 61. You have this, inauguration of the space race. In the meantime, you've got things like the Peace Corps and his, economic incentives and all that kind of stuff. But what you're going to see is shortly after taking office, the CIA is going to come to Kennedy and they're going to say, hey, Eisenhower was really upset about this Cuba thing that Castro had taken over. And so they're, I really think that we need to do something about that. We'd come up with this plan to equip and train Cuban exiles to go over there and retake their country back, so that we're not actually doing the fighting. It's going to be Cuban exiles doing the fighting, but we're just going to kind of support them. This is very typical for what we were doing with Israel in the Middle East or even West Germany. So this was very much in keeping with the 1950s and Eisenhower's way of doing things. Now here's the thing. They create this invasion plan with these Cuban exiles, except it's not a super great plan in the first place. Second off, there's not enough Cuban exiles. And in fact, Eisenhower never really signs off on it, right? They tell him that they're working on this, and he's like, yeah, that's good. But he's out of office before they really kind of get everything finalized. So in April of 61, they come to Kennedy and they say, hey, we've got this plan. And Kennedy's like, and Eisenhower was all excited about it. Well, that's not entirely the truth. And Kennedy, who doesn't want to be weak on communism, who wants to, he'd made an issue out of the Republicans letting Cuba fall to communists. So he wants to be the guy to come save the day and rescue Cuba from communism. So he okays this invasion. Except it's not well done. It's a poor plan, and it's not going well. And so JFK at the last minute will cancel the air support. And so basically these exiles that had invaded Cuba get arrested. The U.S. looks really weak, really incompetent. It also really exposes our tendency in the 1950s and 60s to, like I said, lead from behind, manipulate things, use the CIA, use a flexible response to kind of play with other countries in a way that was actually very much like what the Soviet Union did, right? And so it really makes the U.S. look bad. It makes us kind of a laughingstock, especially when we're trying to be critical of the Soviet Union for doing what they're doing in the Eastern Europe and that kind of thing, or messing around with Vietnam or Korea and all that kind of stuff. So you're going to have the Bay of Pigs crisis is a real embarrassment. So you need to connect Bay of Pigs with Cuba and with the rise of Castro. You need to kind of see that as part of the background for what will become the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'll get to that here in a minute. The next issue that we have is in 1961. Nikita Khrushchev, of course, they had shot down the spy plane. So one part of what they do after they shot down the spy plane in 1960 was, okay, we need to plan a meeting with the new president, right? So we need to talk some things out. We need to air some dirty laundry, kind of express some frustrations with each other. So JFK and Khrushchev meet. And Khrushchev, who's really mad about the whole U-2 spy plane, mad about the U.S. presence in West Germany and all that kind of stuff. And he's mad that we've got so many East Berliners and East Germans escaping into West Berlin and West Germany. Well, if you're the Soviet Union, that makes you look really bad, right? Because part of what the Soviet Union is trying to prove is that our system of government's better than yours. And so when people don't want to stay in a communist country, that means your system of government's not that good, right? And so what they want to do is put a stop to those people fleeing. They want to reduce the American presence in West Germany. And so he basically demands that we leave Berlin and give Berlin completely over to the Russians in order to stop these East Germans from leaving. And JFK is going to say, no, we're not doing that, right? And this is where he gives the famous speech, I too am a Berliner. And in this speech, you're going to see that, or after this, when JFK refuses to cooperate with Khrushchev, Khrushchev orders the Berlin Wall to be built. And you have this wall being built around West Berlin to isolate the democratic side of Berlin from the communist side of Berlin. And this is really perceived as a profound symbol of the Cold War, and a profound symbol of kind of the isolation, and kind of this idea that these two sides can't seem to get along with each other. So be sure you understand the Berlin Wall, where that comes from, that it's tied to that partitioning of Berlin, that partitioning of Germany, and the tensions that are still simmering, from Potsdam, that are still simmering from the blockade of Berlin and the Berlin airlift and that kind of thing. So the Berlin Wall is kind of going to be I won't say a conclusion, because the real conclusion of the Berlin Wall is when it comes down in 1989. But it's certainly kind of this period. It's kind of a lull, right? So it's kind of a significant point, and if you're talking about Germany and that kind of thing. And so you're going to have that. So you've got the Bay of Pigs, that embarrassment. You've got the Berlin Wall being built, which is going to, look kind of bad. And here's some pictures of the Berlin Wall. You can see what we mean. And again, the whole deal of this is trying to keep people from crossing into West Berlin and escaping into West Germany. Because, the whole point of communism is to prove that our system's better. Remember, communism is built upon this idea of influence, and it's very kind of creating buffer zones and all that kind of stuff. So if people don't want to be there, that just looks bad, right? Especially in this battle over ideas and ideology and that kind of thing. The next crisis that we're going to see, and this is tied more directly to the Bay of Pigs, is going to be in 1962. So the Bay of Pigs was a failure. The U.S. kind of, tucks its tail between its legs and all that kind of stuff. Well, Castro, who's very, doesn't trust the United States, and probably with good reason, is of course communist. So he's cozying up to the Soviet Union, and of course Cuba is very close to Florida, very close to the United States, and so what you see is that Castro is going to turn to the Soviet Union, and he's going to offer to let them put nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, the reasoning behind this is this will kind of deter the U.S. from ever trying to launch an invasion of Cuba again, right? Because if the Soviets have missiles there, the Soviets will basically not let the Americans come in and take over their missiles. From the Soviet perspective, the U.S. has missiles in West Germany. They have missiles in Turkey because those are NATO countries. And so from their perspective, those things are on their back door, right? So, they can't help the fact that the U.S. has, got oceans on two sides, right? And so this gives them a chance to put missiles within striking distance of the entire United States. And for them, that seems fair, because the U.S. has missiles within striking distance of the Soviet Union. So you've got this perspective from Cuba and the Soviet Union about putting these weapons in. When the U.S. discovers that they're building these missile silos, basically Kennedy orders a naval blockade to stop the delivery. And he says, look, you've got to start tearing down these missile sites. We're not going to let you do this. Now, understand that a blockade is considered an aggressive action, right? You don't blockade somebody and, oh, well, gee, this is just a friendly squabble. Many times a blockade is a tool of war, right? And so what's going to happen is that you have about 6 days where the whole world is like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Are the Soviets going to declare war on us? Are we going to declare war on the Soviet Union? Is somebody going to launch a nuclear missile? And so then you have a real period of fear, and everyone's expecting there to be a nuclear attack. Now, what will happen is that, of course, Kennedy really doesn't want a nuclear attack, and really neither does Khrushchev. This idea of mutually assured destruction, brinksmanship, the reality is nobody wants to go down that road, because once you go down that road, it's going to change everything. And NSC 68 will kind of help inform this, because you're going to see that the U.S. in 1950, we start really significantly building up our nuclear weapons, so that by the time you get to 62, the United States has a great deal of nuclear capability. And so what's going to happen is the U.S. and the Soviet Union will actually reach a deal where basically the U.S. promises not to interfere in Cuba ever again, and not to invade, rather, and that we're going to remove our missiles from Turkey. And basically the Soviets will remove their missiles from Cuba. And, of course, the part of this deal, too, is that the U.S. had actually planned on dismantling the sites in Turkey. So they're not really giving up that much except the promise not to invade Cuba. And so you really see that kind of the big deal is that we realize that neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union want to declare nuclear war. That we have these weapons of mass destruction, but nobody wants to use them. And so this is going to be kind of lead us down that path of logic that says maybe we can start to reduce nuclear weapons. That if we don't want to use these, why are we making them, right? And so you're going to see that. You're going to see it also leads to the fall of Khrushchev. Khrushchev is seen as very weak. The Communist Party basically kind of pulls him out of power not long after this. And you're also going to see that the Soviets then also turn to conventional weapons buildup, very much like what Kennedy was doing. So they start shifting their military focus. And that will matter because, that's going to put economic pressure on the Soviet Union trying to keep up with that military spending, which, FYI, that's the problem the U.S. is going to have as well. And in addition, when we get to Afghanistan and the invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, this is why, Soviet weapons are just all over the place in the Middle East and all that kind of stuff there. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is a big part of that. You can see that's a famous political cartoon that kind of indicates the significance of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, of course, a map that shows you the range of the Cuban missiles and why it was such a concern, as well as kind of the photograph, the aerial photograph that showed them that they were building weapon sites. So definitely the Cuban Missile Crisis is really the biggest, I would say, the biggest impact of the Cold War, under Kennedy, although certainly the Berlin Wall. But you wouldn't have the Cuban Missile Crisis if you hadn't had the Bay of Pigs first, because had the U.S. not tried to organize an invasion, I don't know that we would have that Castro would have invited the Soviets in, because Castro, for all that he's a communist, is for Cuba first. And so I think that we kind of drove him into their arms. So be sure you kind of understand the scope of the Cold War under Kennedy, especially things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the origins of the Berlin Wall. The next big thing we need to know about Kennedy is his assassination. I often say that really one of his major contributions to civil rights is that he gets assassinated. He was very lukewarm on civil rights, did not really, it's not until the summer of '63 that he actually really takes a stand and publicly, strongly advocates for civil rights bill. And this is all due to things like the Birmingham riots and marches and stuff, as well as the Selma March. Not the Selma March, that's '64, I'm sorry. And the March on Washington in August of '63. And so, he's going to come out, and the March on Washington in '63 is really to show that, yes, we support what Kennedy has asked for. We want this legislation. So in '63, we're starting to head towards an election year. '64 is going to be an election year. Kennedy has faced a great deal of criticism. There's groups like the John Birch Society that have accused him of being a communist. And of course, why they would do that. I mean, he almost went to war with the Soviet Union. But their accusation is that because because the Bay of Pigs failed, because we negotiated out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that clearly he's a communist. Lots of concerns about him. So he's facing a lot of criticism from the far right, from the far conservatives. But there's also people on the left that feel that his civil rights policies have not been aggressive enough. And so he's had a lot of criticism. So the election's not going to be a cakewalk, okay? So he decides to travel to Dallas. Of course, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is his vice president. LBJ's from Texas. And so they decided to travel to Texas to kind of do some political fundraising and all that kind of stuff in anticipation of the election year that's coming up. And so they fly into Fort Worth, have this great breakfast there. And of course, one of the things about the assassination of JFK is, they basically had published the parade route. And this sounds very much like the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? Published the parade route. He was in a convertible, right? I mean, the difference in the way we approach presidential security now is just completely, it's not even remotely the same. So he goes from Fort Worth to Dallas, comes in, they're on the parade route, and of course he gets shot. And when he's killed, you have this real, one of the things that was happening was a filibuster of the Civil Rights Movement, or Civil Rights Act. And so his assassination is going to really make that filibuster look really bad. And so it really kind of builds this momentum. So LBJ, when he takes office in early 64, right? I mean, he's going to ride a wave of kind of sentimentality about we want to approve everything that JFK was ever interested in. So things like the Civil Rights Act, things like the Peace Corps, things like Vietnam even, become really big deals for LBJ. And, you know, and he's able to push through that legislation. Of course, LBJ is this great, he had been in the Senate for a long time. He was a great legislator. So he was really talented at that kind of stuff. So be sure that you are familiar with his legacy, and that it's his assassination that really kind of seals his legacy. You know, we don't have, I mean, what we can remember are these key points with the missile crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, the Peace Corps, the space race, putting a man on a moon and stuff. But we don't have to look at the other stuff, the fact that he was sick, the fact that he had extramarital affairs, the fact that his economic policy was a mixed bag, the fact that his civil rights legislation was very lukewarm. And so, you know, his legacy is very positive because he was assassinated and because we didn't have time to really see where his presidency was going to go. So I think it's important for you to kind of recognize that. But certainly JFK is very important to the Cold War, in part because what you see is that it's under him that we have the baby steps towards negotiation with nuclear weapons, but we also have the buildup of conventional military. And the buildup of conventional military is going to lead directly to Vietnam. So these policies that he's advocating for are actually going to create some issues. These policies of, you know, we're going to cut taxes, but we're going to spend in the military is going to lay the foundation for really some economic hardships later on. You're going to see a lot of little things happening, you know, under JFK that kind of have their origins there. That when LBJ comes in and because he's got this huge support after the assassination, he's going to be able to push through a ton of stuff. Particularly civil rights legislation, but also social reforms, as well as Vietnam. And he's going to get all that stuff done, and then we're going to turn around about 1967 and go, oh crap, how do we pay for all this? What have we gotten ourselves into in Vietnam? So be sure you understand Kennedy. So I'm going to stop here. The next lecture will be on Vietnam, and we'll talk specifically about Vietnam. And then we'll probably test over the Cold War. And we'll come back when we're talking about civil rights and finish talking about LBJ's administration, because his administration is either about Vietnam or it's about civil rights. So we'll kind of be doing both things as we're working our way through that. So I'm going to end it here, and I don't think I went too long, maybe 40 minutes, hopefully.